Hello, my name is Diane, and today I want to talk about fantasy and sci-fi books that don't have any romance in them. Last week I talked about some of the books and series that do have romance that I enjoy. This week I want to talk about ones that don't have any at all. Sometimes you're just not in the mood to read about that. The first book is The Hobbit by J.R. Tolkien. This is the story of Bilbo Baggins, who unwillingly gets roped into going on a trip with a bunch of dwarves and helping them on a quest. There's orcs and dragons and other dangerous things happening along the way. It's kind of just a boys' trip to go do an errand. For everything that happens in that story, there are never any instances where anyone develops any type of relationships with one another. There are some relatives amongst the dwarves. Bilbo and Gandalf seem to go way back, but romantically there's nothing going on there. The next book is Project Hail Mary by Andy Weir. This is the story of Ryland Grace, who wakes up on a spaceship by himself. He has no recollection of where he is or why he's there. He eventually has to figure out entirely on his own what he's doing in space by himself, where exactly in space he is, and you eventually find out that he was sent on a suicide mission to save humanity. So, no pressure, but all by himself he needs to solve this seemingly impossible problem, and there are some unexpected things that happen. We do get some flashbacks to kind of piece together things as he's remembering things, which are very interesting. And, as a guy on a spaceship by himself, it's kind of obvious that there aren't going to be any romantic relationships developing. But I had a lot of fun seeing him figure things out and figuring out what was going on along with him. The next book is Nevermore by Jessica Townsend. This is the story of Morrigan Crow, who is cursed. She's supposed to die on her 11th birthday, and on her 11th birthday she ends up being saved by this man named Jupiter North. He whisks her away to Nevermore and enters her in a competition for a spot in the Wondrous Society, giving her a chance at escaping her fate and living. There are some relationships with other characters, but they're all friendships that develop. There are some really great friendships that happen in this, but no romance, which makes sense. Morrigan Crow's still pretty young. I don't know if eventually in the series we'll end up seeing any romances happening as she's getting older, but for now, there's no romance. There's just some really great friendships, a lot of really interesting magic happening, and some pretty interesting characters that Morrigan gets to know. Next up is Jurassic Park by Michael Crichton. This is, of course, the story of a man who dreams of having a dinosaur zoo, basically, and he invites a bunch of scientists, mathematicians to come and check the place out, and everything that could go wrong goes wrong. There isn't really time for anyone to have any romantic relationships in this story. They're a little too preoccupied trying to escape death and not get eaten by dinosaurs. I really like this book. I don't know that I would call it a horror, but it's a little more horror leaning, which is the type of sci-fi that I typically enjoy, is more thriller type of sci-fi. So there's a lot of really interesting things happening with the plot and dinosaurs. Next up is The Bone Orchard by Sarah A. Mueller. This story follows Charm, who is the Madam of Orchard House, and once a week she serves the Emperor exclusively. On one of these occasions, she is asked by the Emperor on his deathbed to figure out which one of his sons is responsible for his death. There is kind of a relationship in this between Charm and the Emperor. Obviously have something going on, and it's a little bit more than just what she's expected to do for him. But as the story unfolds, you really uncover a lot of trauma. It's not really a book for everyone. There are a lot of heavier topics that we kind of uncover from Charm's past as we figure out what's going on in this house and in this place. But I really liked this story. I liked figuring out who the other characters actually were and what their purposes are within the story, and figuring out what happened to Charm and what got her to the place that she's in when we meet her. The next book is Ender's Game by Orson Scott Card. This is the story of Ender Wiggins, who is drafted as a young boy into battle school where he is trained on military strategy, and him and other children basically compete with each other on military simulations. This is another similar, the characters are kind of too young to be having really romantic relationships, plus it's primarily a bunch of boys competing with one another in a school. There's a lot of bullying and jealousy that kind of goes on between the boys of who's better at what they're doing. And Ender seems to really have a knack for military strategy, but he's also really reluctant at certain points in the book. There is much more of a sibling relationship between Ender and his sister that comes into play in this story, and that's probably the most prominent relationship within this book. Next is A Wizard's Guide to Defensive Baking by T. Kingfisher. This story follows Mona, who works in her aunt's bakery, and one day she finds a dead body in the bakery. She eventually uncovers a plot that the magical folk in her city are being assassinated, and since she's now aware of what's happening, she's become the next target, and she needs to find a way to put an end to this and save the other people in her city and also herself with very little help. She does have help from her familiar, a sourdough starter, which is a very unusual familiar for a wizard to have. I really like the story. I think it has really good conversations about heroes and people saving people and the circumstances that cause someone to become a hero. There's a lot of really fun, unique magic happening in the story as well. Next is All Systems Red by Martha Wells. This is the story of a rogue security unit who has named itself Murderbot. It's not really any surprise that a character called Murderbot is not developing any romantic relationships with anyone, but also because this is an android who's not really good with feelings, doesn't really have the full range of human emotions, is kind of just doing its job, trying to lay low, would really just like to be left alone to watch dramas all day, but also has an obligation to fulfill its duty as a security unit and protect the people that it's been tasked with protecting. Next is I Kill Giants by Jo Kelly. This is about a girl named Barbara who kills giants. Barbara is pretty young. You eventually find out that there are other things going on in her life that are causing her to kill giants. Killing giants is more escapism for her than anything else. It's kind of a sad story once you figure out what's really going on in her life, but it's also very interesting to see how she's coping with everything that she's coping with. And the last book is Sheets by Brenna Thumler. This follows Marjorie, who has recently lost her mother. Her father is really not dealing with it well, and she's kind of stepped up to fill the parental role for her younger brother and also keeping her family's laundry business afloat. The other main character in this is a young boy named Wendell who has recently become a ghost, and he finds himself in Marjorie's family's business and accidentally causes a lot of problems for her. They wind up creating an unlikely friendship once they get to know what's going on within each other's lives and getting to know each other. So they end up developing a pretty sweet friendship as they're both figuring out their different sides of grief, where Marjorie's lost someone and Wendell has lost his own life. And I really like this story. A lot of these books have friendships that happen along the way, especially books written for younger people. The graphic novels and middle grade books on this list definitely have very strong friendships, which I think are really fun to see in stories. Much more interesting to me personally than romantic relationships that develop. Other books on this list don't really have any relationships at all, other than maybe the characters are in similar situations with one another and need to work together, or there's just characters kind of working on their own to deal with something, whatever that something may be, processing past trauma or saving the human race. I found that it was really difficult to find stories, at least of the books that I've read. I'm sure there are more out there that don't have any romantic relationships in them at all. that are either more focused on a person's personal journey on their own, or just people having really strong friendships and that type of dynamic. I mean, unless the story is following very young characters or characters who are isolated, it's kind of difficult to rule romance out entirely. It's part of life. People have romantic relationships, but they also have friendships, and they also have things that they deal with by themselves. So I like to have a little variety. I don't just want to be reading about books where the characters are obviously going to get together because there needs to be a romance somewhere in this story. If there's going to be a romance, I really want to believe that that's a relationship that could have developed between those characters and the things that are happening within the story. But it's also really refreshing to see people who have a good dynamic, who wind up just being friends and having that type of dynamic, working together and building that type of relationship without ever having to take it into a romantic aspect. So those are 10 sci-fi and fantasy books that I really like that don't feature any romantic relationships. Let me know if you've read any of these books, if you liked them, or if there are any other books you've read that don't have any romance in them whatsoever, especially if there's any other great friendship books. I really like reading those. I've recently gotten into those, especially with recently discovering middle grade. That's been a lot of fun to see. So that's all for me today. Thanks for hanging out with me. I'll see you next time.